Today we're going to build a Ubuntu machine in Azure public cloud. So I'm going to try and take the mystery out of it that is kind of surrounded for a lot of people with the whole it's a hacking console, command line type stuff, and just break it down into chunks. So first off, we're going to need to set up a SSH client. We're going to use this to connect to the Linux machine at the end. So first of all, if we haven't already got it on our Windows 10 machine here, which I'm using as my regular desktop, then we should probably install it. So here we're going to add the Windows capability. We're going to use the -online because we're going to get the latest version, and we're going to install the OpenSH .client because we don't want the server. We're just going to be using the client for this purpose. So once that's installed, we're going to need to create a cert file. Now this will be stored within your profile, and you should not share this with other people. So try to create a cert file only for you, ideally, I guess. And we're just going to use the SSH-keygen to do that. Now the default location is under your profile anyway, so that shouldn't really be a problem. So I'm just going to go ahead and enter because that's the location I want to use. You can use a passphrase. I would recommend this if you want super security, but for the moment I'm just going to go ahead with it as is. You could also use some other parameters if you want a slightly longer key. Now I'm going to dispose of this key at the end of the video, so I'm not worried about showing you the output. All's good. Now with that done, we can move on to the if it already exists type questions. So if, as an example, you do not have the network already set up in your subscription, then it's probably best to create one. So here we're going to create a new resource group, we're going to create a network name, and we're going to set our location. So first off, we're creating the resource group. Now since I deliberately cleared out, I knew that there would not be one, so it will just create one. So that's the resource group. Next up, we're going to go ahead and create the network within that resource group. So again, this is something where we say, okay, we have a range of IPs for the VMs to sit on, so that they can effectively boot and get an IP address. And then from there, the network address translation will provide a firewall rule and a external IP for us to be able to connect to it, which we'll configure shortly. So those two parts should now be done. So at this point we have a resource pool, we have a network, and those are the basics. These are the bits which must exist. And you can also see that some of the commandlets could change in future. You always get those warnings. But we're not actually using any of those commands, so we can just continue. So next up, we're going to throw in our firewall rules. Now, again, don't worry about this. If you want to see the exact command syntax and the rest, the link in the video description will contain all of this. But just for the moment, I'm setting up two rules. One for the HTTP and one for the SSH session. So this is going to go in and then create a new network rule for my Linux machines, so my Linux web servers in this case. That way I could reuse that rule at a later point if I wanted to build more of these. So from that we have a nice little output, so I can just see here's my network rule. You can see it's formatted in this lovely YAML format. Not particularly humanly readable, to be perfectly honest, but all of the network related information is there. So you've got source, destination, rules, etc. But that's okay, because we're not going to be realistically using it anyway, because this is just part of the machine config. So we're going to go on and we're going to say, okay, well, what else is part of the config? So we're going to go ahead and say, right, well, we want a public IP, so we've got a commandlet for a public IP. So we say we want the resource group, the location, allocation to be static, an idle timeout in minutes, 4, so we're waiting maximum 4 minutes to get an IP. And this is again piped to our variable because we haven't not finished the config, and we'll be using that in the next part of the config when we're assigning the network adapter. So we're just building step by step here the config. So now that we've got an IP address, we can start doing some assignments for the network. So we move on, and the next section that we're going to drop into here is to create the network adapter. So here we have a network interface. We're telling it again resource group, the location, and you can see we're passing in our public IP.id. So we're collecting it from the previously created one and dumping it onto the interface for it to use. And again, now the interface is just another bit of the configuration. So we now need to take that and we're going to apply it to our machine config. So we're going to now add a few bits where we say, okay, what is the OS? What is the machine type, etc. So we're kind of step by step building bits of information. So we started with the network, then we moved on to the local password, which doesn't matter in this case because we were going to actually get rid of the password because we're going to tell it whether we're using key authentication anyway, but we'll go ahead. So here we now say, okay, the compute name is, the password is, the image is, so we're saying we're using an Ubuntu, we're going to use the latest, and we're providing things like the network credentials. We're saying disable the password authentication, so we're going to use the key. And at this point we still haven't got the key, so we've got now a file that's built up to all of these steps, which is now in the VM config, and we're going to add another one to the VM config, which is we're going to get my local key and push that in as well. So the result is now, if I just show you, we have the full VM config. So this is now what we're going to fire off against Azure and say, hey, build this for me. So you have a long description with several array items underneath. So the storage profile, the network profile, the hardware profile, all of this is now built into that one config. So the last step here is to say, hey, in this resource group on this location, build this config. So here's the last parameter, the VM, is the VM config. So when I start that off, it's going to do a couple of things. One of which is it's going to come back and tell me that I do not have any storage profile there. So it's going to create a storage profile for me. This is used for boot diagnostics and things. Let's say that you had a custom image and it didn't boot properly. You want to know why. That storage profile contains where it sends those bits of information to. So you go, okay, cool, I now know why it didn't boot. So that's one of the elements here. So in general, it's just going to move forward. The other part of this is I'm going to skip or fast forward through the video so that we don't wait for it as long as we would normally. So here we now have a state and a response. So we have, okay, our machine is now existing. That's awesome. So we need to get the IP config, or at least the external IP. So we can do this by resource group. Normally you would pass the machine parameters through, but since we've only got one machine, I'm only going to have one response. So we'll happily use that. We'll just do a SSH session now. But before we do, I'll just show you that you can have the output of this, so we can see, the names, the resources, where it's located, what's associated with it. These are all parameters again, which are sometimes useful, depends on what you're doing. But overall, we can now use that IP config or IP to connect to our machine. So we are going to do a SSH, then the Azure user, which is the name of the user, and then at the IP address that we've specified. We'll get prompted for, do you want to accept the certificate from the machine? And we now have our connection. So we're now connected to a machine that's sitting in West US. And if I do a host name, we can see that it's my VM as per the config. And I guess that's where you would normally start configuring your application if you were going to use a VM, but I'm more of using software as a service than VMs.